Yes!
Close your eyes and let your imagination take the wheel for a moment. Envision a man in his 50s. We'll call him Steve. For the past 25 years, Steve has been employed by a factory ranked #1 in the nation for the mass production of fiberglass. Factory jobs aren't usually something that most people would leap at the opportunity for, but there's a certain level of prestige that comes with dedicating yourself to the same company for a long time, especially when it's been half your life. Day-to-day life in the past 25 years has been relatively monotonous, but Steve has managed to find consolation in the consistency of things. It's time to start the day when his alarm clock sounds off at 5 a.m. After getting out of bed, Steve takes roughly a half an hour to shower, brush his teeth, and get dressed. Steve works at a factory, so his work uniform consists of a long-sleeve navy blue shirt, navy blue pants, safety glasses, a pair of gloves, and steel-toed boots. After getting dressed, Steve cooks himself 3 scrambled eggs, 2 strips of bacon, a hash brown, a slice of buttered toast, and a cold glass of pulp-free orange juice. Steve usually enjoys his breakfast by listening to acid jazz playlists on YouTube on his 55-inch Sony Smart TV. The soothing sound of this genre of music places Steve in an upbeat state of mind, an ideal attitude to go into the workday with. Most, if not all, his peers are married with adult children, but Steve has been a lifelong bachelor out of preference. His luck with dating has never been the best, and he eventually learned to enjoy the peacefulness and the solo reclusive lifestyle. After breakfast, Steve grabs his car keys, turns off his TV, and exits his apartment. Steve's job is in the next town over, but the drive is always quick and easy. 20 minutes on a freeway or a half hour on the back roads. Now, Steve prefers the back roads because it's a straight shot and there's hardly ever any traffic. The 10-minute difference of taking the back roads doesn't matter because Steve doesn't have to punch the clock until 6 a.m. anyways. Before he knows it, upon arrival to work, the most difficult part of Steve's day rears his ugly head, finding a parking spot. Steve drives around for seemingly forever before he's able to find a parking spot about a minute and a half walk away from the front of the building. After exiting his vehicle and walking seemingly forever, Steve enters his job's building from the front entrance and heads over to the break room to hang out for the entirety of the 25 minutes he has left before his shift starts. For the next 12 hours, Steve becomes well acquainted with conveyor belts, loud machinery, and the acrid stench of fiberglass. The only variance in his day exists in the form of an unpaid half-hour lunch break at 1 p.m. and 2 paid 15-minute breaks. The first one at 3 p.m. and the second one at 5. Now, luckily for Steve, the company he works for provides lunch for free, one of the many perks of being employed there. Eventually, the clock strikes 6 p.m., prompting Steve to tidy up his work area, punch out, and head home. After another half-hour journey on the back road, Steve arrives home. For the past decade, he forced himself into the habit of taking a shower within 10 minutes of getting home, because every time he doesn't, the residual fiberglass particles his uniform accumulated throughout the workday will afflict his skin with a volatile full-body itch. Now, it's difficult to build up the inclination to prepare dinner after a 12-hour shift, so Steve decides to eat some leftover meatloaf from a few days ago after showering. Catching up on one of his favorite TV shows sounded enticing after a long day at work, so Steve turns on his 55-inch Sony Smart TV, seats himself in his recliner chair, and enjoys the last few bites of his meatloaf. He's able to make it through a few episodes before fatigue settles in, followed by some much-needed rest. For the next couple of hours, Steve experiences one of the most vivid dreams he's ever had in his life. In this dream, he's a successful business owner with a wife and 3 adult children who all grew up to start their own families and became successful business owners as well. Steve and his wife lived in a 4-story house in Southern California with their 2 dogs, a golden retriever named Zion and a Jack Russell Terrier named Rose. In his dream, Steve was carefree, financially free, and stress-free. Since Steve was a wealthy business owner, he could work as often as he pleased, he could take a vacation whenever he wanted, and he loved his life overall. Steve was happy, and he couldn't ask for a happier life. However, there was one huge caveat to all of this. None of it was real. It was just a dream, and reality hit Steve like a sack of bricks the moment he opened his eyes. His slumber was frighteningly interrupted by a loud crack of lightning outside. Not too long after Steve fell asleep, a violent thunderstorm kicked up, but his deep slumber deafened the volume of his surroundings. Still only partially awake, Steve looked around his living room, confused as to what was going on, until noticing that his smart TV went into screensaver mode after being idle for too long, and the time on the screen read 1 a.m. It took Steve a while to realize that he was asleep for several hours and the amazing life he thought he had was just a dream. Riddled with an influx of confusing emotions, Steve sat upright in his recliner chair, both hands interlocked in front of his pensive visage. For the first time in 2.5 decades, Steve realizes how repetitious his life has been. This entire time, he thought he preferred to live alone and never put any thought into how differently his life would be if he had a family of his own. The truth of the matter is that Steve allowed the motivation to dictate multiple aspects of his life. There came a point in time where his persistence to find his ideal woman extinguished like an oxygen-deprived flame. He He got caught up in the monotony of working an easy job that required zero brain work instead of turning his favorite hobby into a lucrative career. Now, it wasn't mentioned earlier, but when Steve was in his late 20s, he was very artistic. He used to craft his own scented candles and vases for storing potted plants. He was moderately successful at selling his creations as a side hustle, but just as his career was beginning to take off, he was offered a job opportunity with the fiberglass factory. Steve encountered difficulty with doing what he loved while also working 12-hour shifts 5 days a week. His inclination to craft candles and vases just wasn't there anymore because he would get home from work around 6:30 p.m. every night and only had a few hours to himself. In deep thought, Steve begins to question his purpose in life. He was a middle-aged man who divagated from his dreams to work for a company that probably didn't even care about him. Steve managed to survive 25 years working at a company with one of the highest turnover rates in his state. But at the end of the day, he was just another number, and he was replaceable despite how good he was at his job. It took Steve until now to realize that he had a plethora of undiagnosed psychological ailments. But it didn't take a doctor to know that Steve developed depression and anxiety at some point in time in his life. These factors worked hand in hand to derail Steve from the path he was originally meant to follow. Steve sat in his recliner chair with a 1,000-yard stare reminiscent of that of a traumatized war veteran. Encumbered by the gravity of regret and failure, a single tear cascaded from Steve's right eye, and at this moment he realized that his life could go one of two ways. He could compose himself and continue following his dream, or he could continue to make excuses and work for a company that couldn't care less about him. Steve reminds himself that his age has zero jurisdiction of his happiness, and he decides that tomorrow will be the start of a brighter future. He picks up his phone, calls his job's calling number, and informs him that he won't be showing up for work the next day. This would be the first time in years that Steve called into work, but he decided it was time to put himself first because his life revolved around his job for the past 2.5 decades, and he had an overabundance of paid time off anyways. Now, it was nearly 3 a.m. when Steve finally made it to bed and set an alarm clock to wake him up at 10 a.m. After waking up at 5 a.m., 5 days a week, for roughly half his life, Steve decided it was only right to treat himself to an extended slumber. Steve's alarm clock sounds off at 10 a.m., prompting him to wake up, feeling more energized than he's ever felt in his life. Not only did he have a few extra hours of sleep, he told himself that today would be the first day of a brighter future. On the other side of a piece of paper originally used to jot down some groceries, Steve writes down a list of items he would need to start crafting candles and pottery again. After writing down the final item on his list, Steve quickly gets dressed. The overwhelming sensation of excitement made him completely forget to cook breakfast and shower, but the aforementioned would alleviate his concerns as he drove to the nearest hobby store. Steve spends about an hour in the store adding items to his shopping cart until he completes his list and eventually loads all his items to his car and heads back home. He places all his bag items on the floor of his living room after managing to bring everything inside in a single trip. It's been a very long time since the last time Steve enjoyed this hobby, and he wasn't confident that he could do everything from memory, so to refresh his memory, he spends roughly an hour or so watching YouTube video guides. Eventually, Steve transitions his crafting items to the spare room in his apartment. This is a room used for the sole purpose of storing items that Steve couldn't find a place for anywhere else in the apartment. The entire experience was bittersweet. Steve was happy to once again do what he loved, but he admonished himself for throwing the towel in on something that could have made him successful. Now, it took several hours of failed attempts for Steve to put together a presentable candle and vase, but he couldn't have been more proud of himself. It had been over 2 decades since he last did this, but he still had a knack for it, which made him even more proud of himself. As happy as he was to pick up his old hobby again, Steve always hated how messy of a job it was, but he was nowhere near inclined to clean it up, so he told himself he would do it later. He was having such a good time, he almost forgot he had to work the next day, and as badly as he wanted to call in a second day in a row, he wanted to go about things the professional way. Fast forward to the following morning at 6 a.m. Steve arrives to work and hastily makes his way over to the office belonging to Doug, Steve's direct manager. During a brief conversation, Steve confides in his manager that he's making every necessary step towards repairing his mental health and learning to enjoy his life while he's still physically able to. He requests to take the next 3 weeks off as paid time off. A request this spur of the moment would usually get denied, but Steve had multiple advantages at play here. For one, he had been with the company for an incredibly long time, and for two, he had a great relationship with his manager and most, if not all, of his co-workers. Steve was never the most outgoing and talkative individual, but he was a hard-working team player who could always be relied on. Prominent attributes that quickly garnered him some respect from his peers. Also, Steve rarely ever took time off of work. And sometime earlier in the year, Doug did mention that Steve had several hundred hours of unused PTO and couldn't understand why it wasn't being taken advantage of. Usually, there's a several days long wait period for time off to be approved, but Doug informed Steve that he was covered and everything would be taken care of. As Steve prepares to leave Doug's office, Doug instructs Steve to go home because his paid time off will be starting today. Befuddled with disbelief, Steve happily thanks Doug and heads out of the factory to drive back home. Over the next 3 weeks, it was go time. A small spark of motivation evolved into a wildfire determination within Steve, and he spent several sleepless nights perfecting his craft. Before he knew it, the spare room in his apartment was riddled with scented candles and various pottery, and all the conflicting aromas were so powerful he decided to keep a window open in the room at all times. Now that Steve had gotten back into the full swing of things, it was time for him to turn his hobby into a business. Creating a brand name was his first task, and after several hours of brainstorming and scrolling through random internet videos on his phone, Steve decides to go with the name Steve Craft. It was short, simple, and easy to remember. Steve was for certain of this being the start of something amazing, but it was entirely too early for a fully fledged celebration. The next step was to establish some business relationships and facilitate sales. Despite being a loner, Steve always took friendships seriously and always preferred to retain friendships built up over the years as opposed to meeting new people. This worked out for his benefit because several of Steve's longtime friends became very successful in life. A discernible detail the dream he had a while back alluded to. The first person Steve contacted was his longtime friend Thomas, one of the first people Steve met when he started working at the fiberglass company. Thomas only worked there 5 years before several smart investment moves enabled him to live financially free. He now owns several used car dealerships and apartment complexes in town and probably only works twice a week. Steve and Thomas agreed to hold their business meeting at one of the fancier seafood restaurants in town the following day at 8 p.m. Fast forward to the next day. It's roughly an hour before the seafood/dinner meeting with Thomas, and it completely slipped Steve's mind to dress for the occasion. This realization was too spur of the moment for him to go buy some professional attire at the store, so he had to figure out something quickly. Steve has always been a perpetual homebody and never had the biggest wardrobe because of it, so there wouldn't be any real reason for him to own any professional attire. And to be fair, the last time he decided to get dressed up was for his younger brother's wedding 15 years ago. This realization instilled Steve with hope because if he still owned that same suit, he could save the day. In a frantic fit, Steve shuffles through all the clothing in his bedroom closet in hopes of finding the suit he wore to his brother's wedding. After what felt like a forever-long search, something pops into Steve's mind. He finds a tape-sealed shut cardboard box at the bottom of his closet, and if his memory serves him right, his suit should have been in there. So he grabs a box cutter from the top drawer in his bedside nightstand. After opening the box, Steve rejoiced because within the cardboard box was nothing other than the suit he was looking for. It was neatly folded and secured with an airtight sealed plastic wrapping. Steve excitedly removes the plastic wrapping from the suit and is immediately surprised at how well preserved it was. It was apparent that the plastic wrapping did its job because it would be expected to find dead bugs and dust inside. Conveniently, there was also a matching tie inside the box, something Steve didn't expect to find. To his surprise, the suit fit just fine after trying it on, making it apparent that Steve's physique hadn't changed much at all in the past 15 years. He spent a few minutes messing around with his tie until he finally got it to look presentable before noticing that he only had 20 minutes until 8 p.m. hit. The seafood restaurant Steve agreed to meet Thomas at was located downtown, a mere 15-minute drive away, giving him 5 minutes of wiggle room. Luckily, traffic was light, so Steve was about to make it to his destination a few minutes earlier than he expected. And he really needed those extra few minutes of time because it ended up taking him longer than he expected to find a parking spot, since parking spots downtown are always impossible to find. But luckily, his parking spot wasn't too far away from the restaurant. Steve exits his vehicle and speed walks to the front entrance of the restaurant, and upon entry, he notices Thomas standing within the general vicinity of the restaurant's entrance having a phone call. Thomas concludes his phone call shortly after noticing Steve's arrival, as well as his choice of attire in comparison to his own, a purple short sleeve shirt and some black dress pants. The stark differences in their attire became the focus of several friendly jokes exchanged between the two friends. After sharing a few laughs, Steve and Thomas follow an employee standing behind a podium around the entrance of the restaurant to be seated. Over the course of 3 hours, Steve and Thomas spend time catching up, fixating more on their conversation than their food. Steve asks as many business-oriented questions that his brain could think of and takes mental note of all of Thomas's advice. Eventually, Steve and Thomas pay for their meal, say their goodbyes, and leave the restaurant. There was never a point in Steve's life where he wanted something as badly as owning his own business, and over the entire 3-week period of his paid time off, he poured all of his being into his small business. His dedication ran so powerfully, there were nights where he didn't even sleep a wink. Steve worked so hard and so often, it became a common occurrence for him to wake up the following morning in the spare room of his apartment. He invested a lot of time into online research, and eventually started an online store and obtained an LLC for Steve Craft. He also commissioned an artist to design graphic art and business cards and told all his friends and family about his small business. Word of mouth got around quickly, and sales started to pile up faster than Steve anticipated. So there came a point in time where he had to log all his sales and inventory on an online spreadsheet. It couldn't be discredited that fate ran its course because in just 3 weeks, Steve managed to make enough money to cover his rent for the following 2 months. This was a literal dream come true, and for the first time in his life, Steve felt what he believed was true happiness. business. But now he had a difficult decision to make. Did he want to pursue his career full time or continue dedicating himself to the same job he gave 25 years of his life to? Or would it be possible to do both? This was something Steve had to figure out quickly because his 3-week vacation was coming to an end. During the night before his return to work, Steve laid in bed staring at his ceiling, contemplating on the best route to take, and it appeared that he had his mind made up by the time he fell asleep. It was apparent that Steve fell out of routine because after waking up for work, there were several variables in his morning. He awakened at 5 a.m. like he normally would have, but he forgot his safety glasses at home and didn't listen to his acid jazz playlist during breakfast. But he didn't realize any of this until he made it to work. Also, he took the freeway to get to work instead of the back roads. It was evident that Steve had grown tired of his repetitive life, something that made his decision even easier to make. He arrived at work with 40 minutes of time to kill, but instead of hanging out in the break room, he made his way over to his manager Doug's office. Doug welcomed Steve back after Steve requested a conversation. Steve did his best to lighten the weight of the news that he was planning to deliver to Doug by preemptively informing Doug that a big change was on the way. However, Doug already had an idea of what was going on and asked Steve if he would be leaving the company. Steve had known Doug for a long time, so he wasn't surprised by Doug's intuition, but he was still caught off guard from the realization of Doug catching on so quickly. Steve confirmed that he would be leaving the company in favor of pursuing his dream and would be putting forth his 2 weeks notice. Steve could tell that Doug was saddened by the news because no manager would ever be happy about losing one of the company's longest standing employees, but at the same time, Doug was happy for Steve because he wanted the best for him. After the conversation with his manager, Steve leaves the office to clock in and start the workday. Steve encountered difficulty with working half his day away at his job and maintaining inclination to invest time into his business. He eventually figured out a balance and reassured himself that this was just an adjustment and it wouldn't last much longer. The night before his final day of work, Steve set his alarm clock to 4 a.m. instead of 5 a.m. so he could have more time to collect himself since he probably wouldn't be given an opportunity throughout his 12-hour work shift. Steve had mixed emotions. For the past 25 years, the fiberglass factory was all he knew, and as exciting as it was to place all his focus on his business, part of him was sad that he would no longer be working alongside people he had developed close relationships with. As stated earlier, Steve was always a hard worker, and most if not all his co-workers had nothing but nice things to say about him because of how good he was at his job. Steve had plenty of time to mentally prepare himself, and if he ever had any thoughts about changing his mind, he knew it was entirely too late to back out now. Eventually, he makes it to work around 5:30 and heads to the break room for the final time, but something was different. The break room's lights were off, and it was eerily quiet. After Steve turns the light switch on, he notices the entire day shift staff appear, and they all yell surprise simultaneously. Steve's colleagues, including his manager Doug, had thrown him a small going away party because word got around quickly that he was leaving. Steve hadn't told anybody himself because he was planning to do so on his final day of work, but he was happy with what his colleagues arranged for him. For the first 4 hours of his shift, Steve and his co-workers enjoyed cake, ice cream, and each other's company one last time. Steve ended up finding out that all the work was covered by employees from the opposite shift who will offer overtime to cover for Steve's team while they enjoyed the going away party. Towards the end of the going away party, Doug informed Steve that he won't have to work on his final day because some of the remaining paid time off he never used will be used to cover the remaining 8 hours of his shift, and he will be paid out for all his unused PTO. Now this was great news because Steve probably had a few months of accumulated paid time off, and the money he would be paid out for it would be able to fund his business further. As the going away party comes to an end, Steve exchanges handshakes and hugs with all his colleagues and couldn't have asked for a better way to be sent off. Fast forward 6 years. Steve is 62 years old and Steve Craft is a household name in not only the scented candle industry, but the pottery industry as well. There came a point in time where Steve's business picked up enough traction for him to rent out a vacant store downtown to sell his products out of, and several of his part-time employees were his old colleagues from the fiberglass factory. Steve used some of his money for the down payment of a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and thanks to a successful business move, he acquired partial ownership of his old apartment complex because there came a point in time where his old apartment complex was in the process of changing ownership, and he was able to capitalize upon that opportunity. So not only was he making money from his own business, he was also making passive income from his tenants. In this short span of time, Steve reunited with and married his high school sweetheart, a woman named Catherine he dated in his junior year of high school. By the time Steve met Catherine again, she had been divorced 17 years and all 3 of her children were in their 30s and had families of their own. Catherine herself was fairly successful as well. After her and Steve lost touch after high school, she became a successful lawyer and owns a law firm. It was apparent that the dream Steve had years ago was a self-fulfilling prophecy. And even though it took him into his mid-50s to turn his life around, you know how the saying goes, it's better late than never. And from that point on, Steve lived a carefree, financially free, and stress-free life. Okay, everybody, that's the end of the story. Now, the reason why I put this together is because it's a lot of people in this world who work their lives away at a job they don't enjoy, and the only reason why they work there is because it pays well or because it's too difficult to find something better. I don't care what anybody says. Everybody in this world would rather be making money doing something they enjoy versus working for a place that couldn't care less about them. And the majority of these people have a special talent that can make them millions of dollars, but they don't want to put in the work required to turn that talent into a major moneymaker. So they end up getting wrapped up in the monotony and repetition of working a nothing special 9-to-5 job just because it's easier. But you got to understand a few things here. If you would rather be doing something else with your life, but you're continuing to do something you don't enjoy, you will never be happy and you're wasting away as a person. Luckily for Steve, he was able to turn his life around and become successful doing something that made him happy despite it taking 30 plus years for him to do so. But it doesn't have to take you that long to get it together, because your life could change for the best overnight if certain opportunities line up correctly. Moral of the story is, don't allow fear to dictate your life, because before you know it, you will be 60-something years old regretting not taking advantage of any opportunities. If your goal is to live a carefree, financially free, and stress-free life, you're gonna have to put yourself in predicaments that'll test you, because success only comes to those who really work for it. Life is not easy, but why would you make it harder on yourself by not doing anything to make things better? Do everything in your power to fix your mental health and pursue your dreams. You could be traveling the world, going on expensive shopping sprees, the list goes on, but none of this would be possible if you sit around and do absolutely nothing. Always remember that you miss 100% of the shots that you do not take. That does it for this one, everybody. Remember, life is hard, but keep grinding and you will make it. So yeah, y'all take it easy.
Yes!